please type it into the Q&A field on the panel on the right side of the WebEx screen. We will be doing a Q&A session at the end of the webcast, so if you have any questions, make sure and get them in so we can answer as many as possible. If for some reason we are unable to answer all questions, today's webcast is being recorded, and ControlPanelGRC, our webcast sponsor, will contact you to answer any unanswered questions post-webcast. Today's webcast recording and slides will be posted to the ASEG website, and all registrants will receive an email to the link to those materials. Now I'd like to turn it over to our presenter, Scott Goolik, Chief Technology Officer with ControlPanelGRC. Scott?
Thanks so much, Tim. Again, my name is Scott Goolik, and I lead the development and support teams for ControlPanelGRC, but by trade, I'm an SAP security and controls professional. I've been living in this arena since 1996. I originally started with one of the large accounting firms and was tasked with helping develop audit plans for the SAP environment. So I've lived in this environment for my entire professional career, and what we wanted to talk about today were some of the things that you can do to increase the security in your environment, kind of helping you get prepped for an audit. So from an agenda perspective, what I wanted to talk about were 5 key areas that you can look at with your own software and tools that you've got in your system in the delivered SAP environment. We're going to talk about monitoring security and what you can do with looking at what people are doing, how you might utilize that data. We're going to talk about some parameters that you can use to secure your logons and passwords a little further. These are going to be things that your auditors would be checking on a yearly basis when they come in and look at how you have the system security set up. We're going to talk about sensitive authorizations and how this relates to what people can do in your production system, including IT support staff, segregation of duties, etc. We're going to also look at security change controls and just some simple things that you can do to increase your change controls, make sure that changes are getting tested. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some suggested periodic user maintenance processes. So again, these would be reports you can be running, trying to find certain people that maybe should be terminated from the system and so forth. So talking about monitoring security, first of all, you hopefully already know that you've got an audit log in the system that is delivered with SAP, and I would encourage you to check to see if it's activated via the SM19 transaction. Within SM19, you can go and create a static profile, and that static profile is basically what's going to happen and what will be invoked when the system is restarted. When you go and set this up, you'll want to set your filter so that it's active for all users. And you can see we've got the audit classes selected, all of them are there, and the events are set at only critical. So this would show us things like invalid logon attempts, transaction starts that fail when someone doesn't have appropriate access. As an optional setting here, if you click the Detail Configuration button, you're actually able to go and say that we want to record positive transaction executions. And this will give you an idea of what transactions people are actually running in your system. Now, this static profile is just used at the system restart, and it is going to get transferred into a dynamic profile. The dynamic profile is what's really going on in the system today. And there'll be some lights by the dynamic profile, either a yellow or a red light may be shown, and you want to be cautious if you happen to see that on the Dynamic Configuration tab. What that would indicate is a yellow light would mean that you're almost to your daily quota. A red light would mean that you've reached your daily quota and the recording has stopped. Now, these quotas are set up there for a reason. The idea is we don't want the audit log to go overboard with recording transactions or different scenarios in the system. We don't want to fill up the file server. So the audit log parameters are going to be set to make sure that they only record a predefined amount of data per day per application server. So when you do activate this, you'll just want to check and make sure that in SM19 that you're getting the appropriate data and that recording is not being stopped towards the end of the day. From this, you can actually go do a review of the audit log. So if you run transaction SM20, you can go in and put dates, times, specific things you want to look for, and you might see some issues, and we're seeing that in the lower screenshot here, where we see my ID, S. Goolik, and I've run specific transactions, or we see other IDs that have failed and weren't able to log onto the system. As you might guess, these would be good things to be reviewing for audit purposes. So if you're reviewing failed logon attempts, you can determine if someone is trying to break in the system with another ID. Now, it's difficult to do this manually. There is an automated report that you could be running to look for potential risks, and that report is RSAU_select_events. So you can set this report up with an appropriate execution variant and then have your basis team work with you to actually email the output to you on, say, a monthly basis. This will give you the opportunity to review things like invalid transaction starts, figuring out if people are trying to run transactions they maybe shouldn't be, or maybe they should have access to it and don't, or figuring out if there's an ID that seems to be getting locked an awful lot of times due to incorrect passwords. Now, there may be certain things that you actually want to be alerted to. So inside of the CCMS, or the Computer Center Management System in RZ20, you can actually configure certain alerts to be emailed immediately when it happens. So if there's a particular alert that you see as being critical in your organization, you can actually have that generate an email out of the delivered system and send that to you. So you've got all this information. What do you do with it? Well, what we like to do with it is we like to use the transaction executions to help us reverse business engineer. So if we know what transactions people are running, we can grab those and extract them into some sort of an external database. So if you use that RSAU_select_events, you could actually grab the positive transaction executions and store that in maybe an Access database, Excel, or whatever external tool you might want to utilize. And you can use this for a variety of things, like a security redesign or reevaluation. So as an example, if we are looking to redesign our security, we could say, hey, we've got these 10 people in our organization, and they are accounts payable clerks. By going back to this list of transactions, we can actually see what those 10 people have run, and the collective transaction executions might be a good starting point for our new role. We could also use this to help us identify what our SAP licensing should be. So we can look at how many transactions people are running over a year, for example, to determine if they should be a professional or a limited professional. Helping us with scoping implementations or upgrades, figuring out what transactions should be tested during an upgrade as an example. But what about just reviewing the role assignments or transactions in roles for reasonableness? If we know what transactions people are running and we know what roles they're assigned, we can put that data together and determine if there's any instances where a user might be assigned to roles that are no longer being executed by them. Perhaps it was something from an old job they had years ago, and it's funny how people tend to acquire additional authorizations, but those authorizations don't go away over time. They just tend to build. And same concept with transactions and roles. If we've got a list of 100 or 200 transactions that our auditors really care about, we can verify that those transactions aren't in roles where users are not running them and remove them if they do happen to be in some of those roles. Now, in our ControlPanelGRC usage analyzer, we kind of provide reporting like this, so I wanted to give you an idea of what that might look like if you wanted to build some of your own reports in Access. This is where we might see things like a specific user, their user ID, the transactions they're running, and then how many times they're using that transaction over a given period. So we might see that our user, John Byer, has run ME22 2 times over the last year, and maybe that's an indication that perhaps they shouldn't be running that transaction. Maybe it's something that should be taken away. Or they have MM01 and they're not using that at all. Maybe that's not required. Similar concept in finding unused roles per user. So I've got an entry highlighted at the top here for John Payable. John Payable's assigned a number of different roles. A variety of these roles are completely unused. Now, it looks like they had recently run transactions from a payment clerk, but they're not using any of the transactions from the voucher clerk. So if that's the case, perhaps that voucher clerk is no longer required. And lastly, same concept with transactions in your roles. So if we look at our AP payment clerk and we see that they're entering incoming invoices, but they're not actually voiding issued checks, perhaps that voiding issued check transaction could be removed from the payment clerk. So from an audit perspective, this becomes low-hanging fruit for cleanup. So if you're concerned about segregation of duties and you've got a segregation of duty remediation project ahead of you, this is a great way to get your arms around what pieces of your security infrastructure might be assigned that really aren't required for people to do their everyday jobs. So that's a bit on monitoring. Now I wanted to talk about the parameters that you can implement for logons and passwords and provide a few suggestions for them. In your yearly audits, this would be something that your auditors would ask for each time. They'd ask you to run RS-param or RS-USR003 to get an idea of what your parameters are set to for logons. So what I'm going to go through here are some of the key ones and tell you about what you might want to have those values set to. So this first one, login disable multi-GUI logon, this is going to determine if you allow a user to log onto your production system via multiple terminals at the same time. Can they have multiple dialog logons out there? This isn't multiple sessions, but can I sign on from my PC and then go over to my neighbor's PC and sign on again? We recommend setting this to a 1 to prohibit multiple dialog logons. Now, your base team or some of your technical resources might say, well, I need to be able to sign on to multiple machines because I have to be able to go and check a problem a user's having. If you do have that scenario, you can use the login, multi-login users to be able to specify certain logons to be able to access the system through multiple dialog logons. The login fails to user lock, this is going to determine how many failed logon attempts are allowed before a user is actually locked. And we recommend setting this to a value of less than 6 just to prohibit multiple invalid login attempts. We don't want people to be trying to guess the password of their coworker. Failed user auto unlock is going to determine if at midnight a user that's locked due to incorrect logon attempts is going to be automatically unlocked. Most of the systems have this set now to the appropriate value of 0. We don't want these users to automatically be unlocked at midnight. If you get locked due to incorrect logons, you should be locked again tomorrow. The login no automatic user SAP star, this is basically closing a backdoor for the SAP system. If the ID SAP star is deleted out of the database, it's providing a backdoor where you can sign on with the password of pass. We recommend closing this backdoor by setting the value to 1. It's not fully closing the backdoor. Your basis team could certainly change that profile parameter if they needed to and restart the system. But it's just an added safeguard for your environment. GUI auto log out, we want to make sure that IDs are going to be auto logged off the system if they're inactive for a given amount of time. So if a user goes to lunch, we don't want them to have their terminal still signed in with maybe a non-password protected screensaver where somebody could sit down and just start typing. So we recommend setting this to a value of 1800 or 3600, that's 30 or 60 minutes, to reduce the chance of unauthorized system access. A few other things you can do here, table USR40, this gives you the ability to populate impermissible passwords. So we recommend populating this with product names, local sports teams, days of the week, months, really anything that you think people might use in your organization that would be easily guessable as a password. When you enter this, I'd put a star before and after the word that you're entering. So if you're trying to do a sports team and you were doing Bears, you'd want to do star, Bears, star. Now, I'm not advocating loading a dictionary in this. I think you just want to make people have a reasonably secure password. The login password expiration time is going to determine how many days the password is valid before it expires. And my comment here is to make sure you find a happy medium. If you make someone change their password every 30 days, there's a better chance that they're going to be writing it down. And what you don't want is someone to have that Post-it note under their keyboard with their password. So you've got to find a balance to it. And that's the theme with a lot of these parameters. We usually recommend a value between 60 and 90 days so that you're requiring a password change every few months. Minimum password length, you're going to want to set a minimum password length that is equivalent to what your network security policies would dictate. So if your network security policy dictates 8 characters, your SAP system should be 8 characters as well. Password complexity, so you've got a variety of different parameters you can put in to make sure that a digit is required, a letter, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, different characters between the previous and current password. Again, you just need to find a balance here. So we recommend that you require a letter and a digit and maybe a special character, and then have that go up to that minimum length of 8 characters total. Some password policy requirements, the login password downwards compatibility. So as you know, when you moved up to the 7.0 basis release, your password grew from 8 characters to 40 characters. You do have the opportunity of turning off that 40-character password. We only recommend this if you have an environment where you still have some older systems that have the 8-character password and newer systems with the 40-character. This would allow you to have your users with the same passwords across the systems if they wanted to. That's really the only time I've ever seen customers deactivating that longer one. If you do make changes to your password policies, you have this parameter password compliance to current policy, which at the time of logon is going to make sure that the current user's password is complex enough to meet the current requirements. So if you make changes, you could set this parameter to 1, and that's going to make sure that anyone who doesn't have a complex enough password would need to go in and actually change their password upon the next logon of the system. The next two I like for trying to make sure that passwords aren't staying out there without users really accessing the system. The password max idle initial. This is going to be an expiration times in days for an initial password. So if you use a very well-known initial password for users like initpass or welcome1, it might be easy for someone to sit down and guess an initial password of a user. As a result, we recommend setting this parameter to a value around 7 days. So that means that an initial password would be good for 7 days, and after that point, it's like they've been locked and have to have their password reset. Similar concept for max idle productive. This is going to be an expiration time in days for a productive password. And we recommend setting this to a value between 120 or 180 days. And this would usually be around double what your password expiration is. And the idea here is that you want to minimize your number of inactive users in production. If a user hasn't changed their password in 120 days, they likely haven't logged in the system in at least 60 days, if that's your minimum for password change time. So this is a way to automatically exclude inactive users from the system without having any sort of an external product. You can also do a user-based security policy. This is showing up in some of the newer basis releases. I think we're starting to see it as of 7.3.1. And this is in transaction SEC poll. And you're able to actually differentiate the password parameters by a group of users. So you could set your contractors, as an example, to have a slightly different security policy than your normal employee users. And that could include more complex passwords or passwords that can be idle for a shorter period of time in case that contractor leaves the organization. I mentioned generated passwords before. I'm definitely not a fan of generated passwords because they're easily guessable. But the password wizard functionality that SAP provides us by default is pretty complex. So when you get into that newer 7.x system with a 40-character password, if you click the password wizard button, you're going to get a string of characters that is absolutely impossible to type in manually. As a result, we recommend customizing table PRGN-cust. And if you go in there in SM30 and you do this in your dev system and you would transport it forward, you can set these values down here that we're showing in the table. And it's the fields gen, PSW, max digits, max length, max letters, and max specials. And you would set that to map to what your password requirements are. So in our example here, we're saying that we want an 8-character generated password. We want 4 digits, 4 letters, no special characters. So this is a great way to set up an initial password that's not guessable and also not impossible to be typing in. Now, once you set these password parameters or logon parameters, you do have to monitor them. And you may realize that these parameters are set by application server, and therefore from the audit perspective, you really need to check all of your application servers to make sure they're set properly. If you run the RS-USR003 report, you're going to see these parameters in here. I've highlighted some of the ones that we've talked about here with the values that are set in our current system. And this can be a painful process to make sure that they're set up, but what you don't want to have happen is that your auditors come back and say, hey, you've got your minimum password length properly set on one application server, but on the central instance it's not set. So you'd want to go through and check those. Within our control panel product, we can actually check for these parameters. So we're showing here setting a baseline set of these parameters, and of course you'd want to customize these to your environment. But Control Panel can actually reach out to us. when we have instances that our value doesn't map, so these entries highlighted in red, indicating that our value that's currently set doesn't map to what the baseline's intended to be. This can also tell us if the parameters are differing across our application servers, which is, again, another risk from the system's perspective that the auditors are likely going to tell you about, and you don't want to have that happen. So that's a bit on the logons, passwords, parameters, and how you might monitor them. Now we'll talk a bit about sensitive authorizations. And I've kind of lumped sensitive authorizations, critical transactions, segregation of duties all into one section here to talk about. The first thing that I want to comment on is that you should go through and make sure that you don't have SAP-all assigned to any dialog or service logons in your system. If your auditors find this, there's no way they're going to let that go. So it's possible that you've got a batch ID that has SAP-all assigned, and maybe it's incorrectly classified as a dialog or service user. Make it a background user so you don't have to answer the question. A lot of our customers have gone through and implemented what I'll call fire call procedures to provide emergency access. And that might be an automated process or a manual process. But the concept of this is if your IT support staff is in the production system, they may need to get additional access for a temporary period to get around a problem. So at worst case scenario, from a manual process, you can have them logging a help desk ticket. The help desk ticket contacts the security team. Security team provisions that additional access for a temporary period. The user signs in, does their stuff. The security team deprovisions the access and then goes in and does some reporting to push it off. Now, it's a time-consuming process, but that's the type of thing that your auditors are going to want to see being done. We have an automated solution for this. There's probably people on the phone that use the SAP GRC super user privilege management or firefighter, excuse me. We have an emergency access manager with ControlPanelGRC that does something very similar. So you have a self-service process for elevated permissions. You can go to this, get some additional capabilities. The capabilities are granted to your current ID without any generic logons in the current session. And then you've got documentation of what was done by that user so that you can get a sign-off. This is the type of data that your auditors want to see. Whether you do it through another product, a manual process, through our solution, it doesn't matter. But your auditors want to know that you're executing an emergency process, granting that temporary access, and you're doing the logging. However you get to it's up to you. But we see this a lot where customers are starting to get beat up if they still are allowing a lot of access for the IT support staff in a production system. Reducing sensitive authorizations would then be kind of the next piece of this. So if we know that our SAP-all has been removed and our IT support staff are restricted well, then we got to start looking at what the end users have access to. And you may or may not know this, but you don't need to have a custom GRC solution to do this. There is a report that's delivered in SUIM. It's RSUSR 008_009_new. And that gives you a chance to check for critical authorizations as well as segregation of duties. So what you would do is you go through the process and you populate your critical authorizations. And critical authorizations would be similar to the function concept that's used in the ControlPanelGRC risk analyzer, and also similar to the function concept that you see in Rule Architect inside of the SAP GRC product. You would configure critical transactions based on your business processes. Maybe sales order creation is a critical transaction or group of transactions. Vendor master maintenance. So you're able to go through and define those, define your transactions, define your authorization objects. In addition, you want to be able to define the specific authorization objects that you might find your auditors are asking you about. Ones that we very commonly see would be SBatch admin, SNumber. So it's the things that the auditors are trying to find what your users can do in the production system. SAP has provided us a starting point for those sensitive authorizations that you can actually paste in here. So we're seeing them, and we're seeing the ability to use background jobs, administer CCMS. It's a variety of things that you wouldn't expect your end users to have. So you can start with these predefined critical authorizations. But here's a few other things that you might want to consider. So as an example, the ability to debug replace or debug display in your production system is a bad thing. So debug replace is probably one of the most sensitive authorizations in the system because it would allow you to step around authority checks. So if I can debug replace, I can walk through the code and I can get to the point where it says you don't have access to change this, and I can replace the variable and say yes I do. So that's given with sdevelop activity02 for object type debug. Most people think that debug display doesn't have that same sensitivity. Perhaps it doesn't, but if you happen to have sensitive data in your system, like HR master data or other pieces of information that you find critical to your business, debug display is also a risk. The way the HR authority checks work, it actually is going to load that data into the internal tables there, and then it's going to determine you don't have access to it and pull it out. So with debug display, you could actually view the data before the authority check says you don't have access. You don't want people to have the ability to maintain workbench objects in your production system. So if you find the authorization object s_develop with an activity that's not equal to 3 or 16, you'd want to ask about that. Ability to process system functions, really the sadme_fcd authorization object with any values. This is things like client creation, system message maintenance, data deletion without archiving, displaying spool lists is coming up in the next one here. These are things that you, in general, if you find sadme_fcd in your end user roles, you'd want to be asking why it's there. It shouldn't be. The ability to display spool requests of other users. So this is, again, the sadme_fcd authorization object, and it's usually in conjunction with the sspo_auth authorization object. You don't need to have these objects to display your own spool requests. So if these are here, you can assume that someone has the ability to display another user's output, which may be bad if you've got someone in HR running reports or someone in finance that's running an income statement and outputting it to the spool. The ability to submit batch jobs as another user is controlled with the sbtch_name authorization object. So this is another one you want to make sure is secured so that if I encounter a scenario where I'm not authorized to run a report, I can't just run it as another user and then get the output from the spool. The ability to maintain configuration is controlled by the stabudis authorization object, specifically activity02. And when this is granted, you have the ability to maintain a specific set of tables. Now, your basis person might come back and say, well, our system is locked. It's really not a risk that you can maintain all tables via stabudis. Well, that's not true because there are specific tables that you can maintain in a locked system, like exchange rates or posting periods. So you want to make sure that when people have access to stabudis with activity02, that it's a specific set of tables they can maintain. The SRFC ACL might be one of the most sensitive authorizations in the system. This actually gives you the ability to log on remotely as someone else, and that's bad. You shouldn't be able to use this trusted system infrastructure that's delivered in the system to become another user. So what you'll actually find is that this authorization object is not part of the SAP all profile that's delivered with the system. But when you set up trusted systems, you have to have this. So you need to make sure that the authorization object is set to not permit you to sign on as someone else. The ability to execute programs and function modules, this is transactions like SE37 and SE38. It might look at sprogram. It might look at sdevelop activity 16, depending on your release. So you might want to check and see what's going to give people the access to actually execute these programs or function modules. But that's a risk because you don't want someone to be able to just go and run any report they want. So we've got an example of a report here that enables execution of operating system commands. The RFC ABAP install and run is a function module that can insert source code into your system, run it, and then delete it. So that'd be pretty bad as well. These are just reasons to restrict that access. And you may know that SAP has a lot of what I'll call backdoor transactions. So the front door to get into role maintenance may be PFCG, but here's another one here, this S_XBA transaction that's going to get you into it. There's literally hundreds of those types of transactions that provide backdoors into a common transaction that you may be trying to restrict. And you definitely have to use some caution to make sure you're not inadvertently giving someone too much access, either via the ST code or the underlying authorization. Some additional critical authorizations that you might be wanting to look at, ability to execute vendor master maintenance, so transactions like MK01, MK02, FK02, FK01, etc. and you'd want to grab another one and set up purchase order maintenance, so ME21, ME21N, and so forth. And you would then want to combine those critical transactions as part of that RS-USR 008-009 new report to be able to find people that can do those things. And obviously, this is not a complete list. This is just trying to get you thinking of different things that would be a risk to your business if you allow people to have access to them. Now, when you set up those critical transactions, and we've got an example down here at the bottom that we set up 2 critical authorizations, for one for purchase order maintenance and one for vendor master maintenance, we can then combine them inside of this RS-USR 008-009 new report. Now, SAP doesn't deliver any critical combinations, but it gives us that infrastructure so that you're able to go in and run some reports and see what users might have access to conflicting transactions in the system. So some examples of critical combinations: being able to create vendors and initiate purchase orders, create purchase orders receiving goods, maintaining a vendor and then cutting checks. I think you probably get why these are concerns, but you don't want people having too much access in the system. You don't want someone to be able to maintain multiple portions of the same business transaction. So we spend a lot of time working with customers on this stuff, the sensitive authorizations, excessive access, critical transactions, segregation of duties. It's not easy. That's definitely not. In our ControlPanelGRC risk analyzer, we can very easily spell this out from a business perspective so that you could push it out to your end users to actually sign off on, or to controllers at a location. So this would be a real-time analysis of the data, and we use our delivered best practice rules to find things like, hey, we've got John Buyer here, and John's got the ability to enter a fictitious purchase order and receive goods, which is classified as high. And of course, we could drill into this if we wanted to see more details about it. But this type of report is the type of output that your auditors want to see, that you're reviewing on a periodic basis, and that your business users believe that the access is appropriate, or maybe there's compensating controls that need to be put into place. So it's a challenging process, and definitely something you want to make sure that you've got behind you when the auditors come into play. So in addition to the sensitive authorizations, we want to start looking at security change controls. So making sure that as we're making changes to our roles in the development system, that it's getting sent forward to production in the appropriate sequence with testing and so forth. So first thing we want to make sure is that in our production system, our security team doesn't have the ability to maintain the roles. So we want roles to be managed in the development system. In fact, we want to make sure that only the security team can maintain those roles in development. So in production, we can restrict the security team to display only. This is another setting in that PRGN cust table. Set the flag assign role auth to assign, and that's going to make sure that you don't have to have change access to roles, the S-user AGR authorization object, to actually go in and make an assignment of the role. So this is a great way to make sure your security team is restricted and that no changes are processed on roles in the production system. If possible, you'd even like to implement segregation of duty checks so that the same person isn't changing the role in development and then assigning it in the production system. We recommend recording role definitions, so just a text description of each role. So you might do this in Excel or use the profile generator where you've got that description tab. But if you're able to put a definition, you can put some business terms around what the content of a technical role is. So we've got a role for a procurement clerk, and we can put the various tasks that a procurement clerk is intended to do. And then when it's time to request access or recertify that the appropriate people have access to these roles, we're able to go back and see what that description was and remember why we built this role, what it was intended for. If a role is going to be assigned in a production system, we usually recommend that you need to have an owner for it. So that owner is going to be the person that signs off on contents of the role or who gets assigned to the role. So you might have differing owners for assignments at different locations. It's entirely up to you. You need to document your security change processes as well. So if you get a request that comes in to add a transaction to a role, you want to make sure you're validating that the appropriate person sent that request in. So we got it from the right role owner and making sure that it's truly approved. We make our changes in development, and then we're going to send them to quality for testing purposes. And then we want to make sure we get approval from the role owner to send that tested change to the production system. We also need to make sure we document our role testing processes. Role testing is one of those things that customers tend to cringe at. You make a change and the business user is thinking, or the person requesting it is thinking, why do I have to change this? It's the most simple change, and that's because they don't understand the complexity involved in making security changes. So what we try to do is to make sure that this is as easy as possible for your role owners. So as a recommendation, make permanent test logons in your quality system. Create one for each role to make sure that they can go in and do testing at any time. When you set up this test logon, make sure you include any common or display roles that will be assigned to all users assigned to the role when it gets to the production system. Make the password easy to remember unless that test environment contains sensitive data. So if it's easy to remember, then the user would be able to sign in and do their testing at any time. We also recommend setting the test IDs to service users. A service user has a password that doesn't expire, so you don't have to worry about a person signing in and the password got changed from a certain value to a different value and nobody knows what it is right now. If it's a service user, the password doesn't change. You can sign on to it multiple times if you happen to have that parameter set to disable multi-user logons of the system. We talked about that usage or that reverse business engineering data earlier. If you're capturing that data in your quality system, you can actually see how much testing is being done. So you can compare the transaction executions, the number of transactions in your roles, and see if the roles appear to be adequately tested. And we do have a tool for this. ControlPanelGRC's quality assurance will actually create test logons for you automatically, and it manages the test logon process. So instead of having to sign on with a user ID and password, the user can just click into an ID that they're authorized to utilize. It'll remotely log in as that user, show them what transactions are in the role, show them which ones haven't been tested, and give them an interface for running through all those test scenarios. And then, of course, we can monitor the testing progress. And when the team comes back and says, hey, our testing is complete, we didn't find any defects, you can say, you signed on to 6 of your 10 roles and you ran 3 transactions from each of them. Are you sure the testing is complete? Periodic review of role assignments and transactions by role owners. You need to do some recertification. If your auditors aren't asking this from you yet, they will. So from the recertification, you actually want to push out reports to the appropriate role owners so that they can verify that the appropriate parties are still assigned to their roles, that transactions inside of the roles are reasonable, and those definitions are going to help remind them of what is inside of their roles and why they were created in the first place. We also like to send out a verification of changes made to their role over the previous period. So that might show things like the transactions added to the role or removed, as well as the users assigned or removed from their roles. So this is a way that they can validate that appropriate or access hasn't changed without their knowledge. And this is something that's a challenge to do manually. It's very difficult to pull all this data together, push it out to the appropriate parties, collect the sign-offs, make the changes. Inside of ControlPanelGRC Access Certification Manager, you can actually take this entire process and execute it with a single click to push it out to the appropriate owners, gather their feedback, and automate those role changes. It would look something like this. So we might get a report back saying, here's the transactions in your AP payments clerk. And we're seeing here some transactions that aren't being used like FCH9, so we're requesting the removal. And down here we can see that John Payable is assigned to this role, hasn't run transactions from it in over a year. Perhaps that could be removed. So you've got some flexibility there to be able to remove the access and then get that routed to the security team for processing, or in the case of the user changes, automatically deprovisioning the access. We could even include segregation of duties checks in here and be able to what happens if I take this out? Do I fix some of my problems? So the last section then is just talking about some periodic user maintenance processes that you can do to strengthen your security. So first of all, if you have SAP HR, you can really use some data there. So inside of the SAP HR system, you've got the most important information about your employees, maybe even your contractors, when they join, when they change positions, and when they leave. So if you can integrate that information, you're able to automatically expire logons when an employee is terminated. Or if someone changes positions, maybe we need to send a workflow out to their manager saying that, hey, if you don't do anything, the security they currently have is going to expire in a month or 2 weeks. That's some automation that we're able to do through ControlPanelGRC. We just recommend that you use whether it's dynamic actions, reports to security. Make sure you're getting that information and you're acting upon it. If someone's a contractor, we want to make sure that they've got expiration dates on their account, usually 6 months in the future. So you can set up validity dates inside of SAP user master records, and if someone's assigned to one of these user groups, maybe you set up user groups for consultants, contractors, or general external parties, make sure that they're going to expire at some point in the future. You can go through and revalidate periodically if the users should retain access to the system, but you don't want them to keep access if they're no longer with the organization. You can also review the current users in your system for invalid logon attempts, initial passwords, or even inactive users. So this is the RS-USR 200 report, and we've got this set up to review a certain set of users that haven't signed on the system in over 90 days. And we could look for users that have an initial password, users that are locked. And the idea here is that if you run this report on a monthly basis, you can get your arms around your inactive users or users with initial passwords, and you can then go through and manually lock them. So even just doing it once a month is going to be a great way to tell the auditors, hey, we have a control in place. It's a manual, but we've got it. And of course, we do have an automated solution with ControlPanelGRC's User and Role Manager if you wanted to identify and lock these users automatically, maybe on a more frequent basis, without having to go in and manually run these processes. Users with sensitive roles or profiles, we talked about SAP All a little bit earlier, making sure that you don't have any users assigned to SAP All, but we probably want to be monitoring who has access to what we deem to be sensitive on, again, a monthly basis, I'll say. And you can use the RS-USR 002 report to review those sensitive roles or profiles. We've listed some of the sensitive profiles that are delivered with the system. These would be basis administration, full access, developer type capabilities. And also monitor sensitive roles that are unique in your environment. So if you've got a role that's a basis admin, you want to make sure the right people have access to your basis admin role. If you have what I'll call a SAP almost role, not quite everything, making sure that the right people have access to that. And then going back and looking at the verification of standard SAP logon passwords. So your delivered SAP system comes with some users, and if they happen to have the initial passwords that were provided by SAP, it's easier to break into the system. So we're seeing here that SAP star doesn't exist. We could log on with a password if passed, and they're even giving us an OSS note that we could look up and get some additional information about it. If you run this report on, say, a monthly or maybe even a weekly basis just to make sure nothing bad has happened, you're going to be able to show your auditors that you're actually monitoring the stuff and you're taking the precautions to protect the system. So with that, I'd like to turn it over for questions.
All right, Mark, there's some that came in, there's some that came into my box, and here's the first one. This is from Patty. Does the RBE data reporting only look at the T-code execution, or does it also evaluate other authorization objects? In other words, if a T-code is in 2 roles a user has, do both roles get flagged even if really only using /needs the one role?
Sure, and great question. The type of data that we can get from RBE, whether it's coming out of the statistical records in the system or the audit log, is really at the transactional level. So if a user does have multiple roles that are providing access to the same transaction, it's more of a judgment call to determine which role has the appropriate authorizations to use that transaction. So with that type of a concept, you can't just say, well, they're assigned this role and they're running the transaction, but they're really getting the authorizations from the other role, because you wouldn't know with the way that the underlying authorizations are shared. And there's not any sort of logging in the system that would capture that type of data.
Okay. There's one here that came in the Q&A, and he says it might be possibly beyond the scope of the webinar, but are there similar tools that allow for integrated security management for SAP Suite that extends beyond ECC? Example, SAP ECC that is integrated with SAP BW, SAP Business Objects, BI, Ariba SuccessFactors, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And ControlPanelGRC is one of those tools. When you have those other systems, you're just actually doing connections to those other targets. So as an example, in a BI system, we talked about sensitive authorizations and segregation of duties. In BI, you have those sensitive authorizations. You still don't want to have someone to have the ability to maintain BW workbench objects, but you likely don't have segregation of duty concerns because you probably don't have business transactions actually being executed in BI.
Okay. There's one that came into my box. Is there a resource where we can find all equivalent transaction codes? For example, PFCG equals S_ALR underscore.
You don't have to read that one. I know what they're referring to.
Okay, great, because I didn't. Go ahead.
There is not a resource where you can get that. Unfortunately, those transactions are hidden in your IMG. So if you go into transaction SPRO and you start navigating through those branches, you unfortunately are going to run into those additional transactions that kind of backdoor you into it. So some of the GRC products like ours will actually go and find those transactions for you, but it's unique to your system. It's not like there's a specific list because it's generated from the IMG, and it's very specific to a release.
Okay, one just came in. We use single sign-on for ECC and SAP GUI. What are your password setting recommendations? For example, do you recommend deactivating passwords? We use the CRM Web UI also.
Great question. With deactivating passwords, it all depends on if you ever expect the user to not be able to log in via single sign-on. So as an example, we had a customer that did an upgrade, and when they did that upgrade, the single sign-on was something that they hadn't tested as part of it, and that broke at go live. When that happened, the users couldn't get in to test. Now that's kind of an extreme, couldn't get in to use the system. That's kind of an extreme scenario, and the basis team was able to sort that out pretty quickly. But if you don't have users that are going to be signing on to the system via their password, then there's not really a concern in disabling that password-based logon.
All right, so here's another question. What type of access do you see our clients providing to their IT personnel in the prod system?
What we're seeing is that we see the IT support staff being limited to display only in production. So that's a very common setup, and they're using an emergency access procedure like I was discussing through this presentation to provide additional access when that scenario comes in that they need to, say, change a pricing condition. So, and then you need to do either the manual logging or have a tool that's going to automatically log what they do during the session.
All right, let's see. Does logging require a GRC system?
The logging that I was showing at the beginning of this does not. It's what you do with it that might require something additional. So I showed the security audit log is an easy way that you can grab data. It's a little bit of a pain to extract that data on, and actually go in and do it on a monthly basis and grab it and put it into your own database. But it doesn't require any sort of an external product to do, and it's something that's really easy from a compliance cleanup perspective.
Okay. Are there any other questions out there? We've got a little quick. Get your questions in. We've got some time left. At this point, do you want to say anything about anything else that's come up? Any questions that you've kind of thought of? And Scott, how about you? Any thoughts actually from your webcast so far? Any of the questions that come up from you?
No, I thought the questions were great, and if anybody has any additional questions, my contact information is on this slide as well. You're welcome to follow up with me directly.
Okay, well, I don't show any questions coming in currently. I guess at this point we will go ahead and kind of end the webcast. I want to thank Scott for giving a really great and informative talk today. He's, of course, the Chief Technology Officer at ControlPanelGRC. Also, thank everyone out there for attending. We always love our members to attend, and if you have any questions, you can certainly let us know at affiliates@asug.com. Today's webcast has been recorded, and the recording link and slides will be posted to the ASUG website. All registrants will receive an email with the link to the materials. And with that, I'd like to close today's program. Have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you on the next ASUG affiliate webcast. Thank you so much.